Now let's shift over to one of my other favorite topics, superheroes. I've been obsessed with Watchmen on HBO, and we're up to episode 5. I wasn't able to catch up on episode 4 while we were traveling, but I've watched both episodes today, and I'm still trying to process them. Both I thought were really, really solid episodes. 4 was, I think, more exciting for me because I think Watchmen really hums when there are a lot of divergent stories and a lot of things going on at the same time. It gets a little frustrating because you're trying to reconcile all of the connections to the lore that you may remember or recall, and I still haven't had time to go back and read the comics again to kind of refresh my memory on everything. But more and more little bits and pieces are connecting the dots from events that happened 30 years ago, which is represented in Alan Moore's comic, and what's happening now 30 years later. In episode 4, we're introduced to a new character, a new superheroine, I guess. I think mostly through her wealth. Her name is Lady True, and she is creating some incredible clock, some incredible wonder in the middle of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And starts off as this fascinating opening where she walks in on a couple that were unable to have a child years ago and says, I want to buy your land, and I'm going to buy your land by giving you this baby, which we use through the baby making service that we have in Tulsa that I own. I've created this baby, and I'm going to give you $5 million. I want your house and your land. And they sign right on the dotted line. And she's just ruthless. She actually has an hourglass and says you've got 3 minutes to make a decision. And they basically sign their lives away, but take the baby. And that couple goes on to have a good life. That's a whole other spin-off show, I think, from HBO. But she's fascinating right out of the get-go. And there's definitely some connection with Angela Agar. That's the sort of the main heroine that we've got to know on the show, who also grew up in Vietnam. So we've got a nice sort of combination or a nice connection between these two, which was really cool. But I liked that introduction, and I liked that there was a little bit more sort of sleuthing going on by the main FBI agent character, who's trying to understand exactly what's going on and who knows what, and she's trying to basically turn some of the cops against each other in episode 4. I thought that was a lot of fun, and there's a lot of threads that are introduced in episode 4, and at the end of it, I was like, well, that was very entertaining, but I'm starting to get a little bit frustrated with all of the different sort of paths that this show can go. And, Damon Lindelof, who's the showrunner on here, has a history of laying down tracks and then not quite fulfilling all of the things that you want out of the show. That's why I was kind of happy to see that episode 5 shrunk the narrative and focused a lot more on Looking Glass. This is Tim Blake Nelson's character, and we get to see his backstory, his basically his origin story. He survived the giant squid attack that happened in the 80s, 30 years prior to the events of the show, and they actually showed it on screen, and it was a pretty cool effect, and the devastation that rippled out. He wasn't in Manhattan at the time. He was on the outskirts, but he got to see it affect a huge chunk of the population. And so we get an understanding of why this guy wears his Looking Glass mask, which reflects everything around him. He also wears almost a literal tinfoil hat because he's basically a conspiracy theorist. He's been completely effed up by all the stuff that happened by the squid coming out of the other dimension and landing on Earth and killing all those people, as one would be, I think. And so he questions everything. He's very fearful. He's got an incredibly ornate alarm system in his house. And we get to see Tim Blake Nelson kind of go full on, he's a bit nutty. He's filled with anxiousness, and he's definitely very suspicious of everybody. Some great performance work there. And he meets some... He has basically a focus support group that he runs, and he tries to help other people that have been affected by the events of the squid falling on Manhattan. And he meets this interesting lady, and they strike up a conversation, and that leads to some, I'm not going to spoil it, but that leads to some interesting developments where we get to find out a little bit more about who Looking Glass is and how he factors into the greater scheme of things. We start to see some betrayals, and we also get a real understanding of who Veidt is, Jeremy Irons' character, who is been desperately trying to escape this beautiful prison that he has put himself in. And at the beginning of the show, we actually see him creating new clones. And it's just a horrific image where he's farming the clones in this lake, and he pulls out babies out of the water, and he throws some back because he's not happy with them. And it's like, oh, it was so creepy. And then he creates full-grown adult clones out of these little embryos, these little babies that he has, and some surreal stuff there. And so suffice to say, by the end of episode 5, not only are we starting to laser focus on what the plot of this season is, but we're getting some real understanding and some real connection to stuff that happened in Alan Moore's comic, interwoven through Lindelof's new storytelling, which may be a little much for hardcore fans to take, because he has really sort of fused himself into the weave of Watchmen. And I know how much it means to a lot of fans out there, and people might not be crazy about some of these choices, but I find it fascinating, and I also find it kind of fitting, because in the comic series, it was it created this question about what would real-life superheroes be like in our world that we know and exist in. And this kind of takes it to another degree, because now we've obviously had 20 years of comic book movies and superheroes on screens in every sort of format out there. And it's almost like a funhouse mirror, looking back at itself a little bit, you know? And I thought that was, I've been really digging it. I think it's an interesting choice, and I think that it was a fascinating and bold idea for HBO and for Lindelof and for the creators of the show to even go back to this work and try to embellish it. And so far, I've really been entertained. This is another one of these shows where I don't know where everything is going, and it's a nice surprise, and I want to check in with these characters every week, even if the tension is uncomfortable. And I just think it's really cool. It's a really cool and a very, very smartly crafted show. So I'm in. I'd give episode 4 an 8 out of 10, and I would give episode 5 an 8.5 out of 10. Not my favorite episode so far, but I like this show a lot, and I can't wait for episode 6. I'll have some thoughts on that next week.